it's a little confusing. So I'm in Los Angeles in my studio. Magdalene is actually in the gallery, but she's showing screenshots of the gallery because of we can't move around. So this is the show that's currently up. And these are, new figurative paintings that came out of a process that was creating like a little film for the Super Bowls. So so this quick walkthrough, we can talk more in detail about like how the work developed. But this is to give some idea of what is actually live right now in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. So that's the main room.
Okay. Did you want to show the video? Or just...
No, people I think can check out the video, maybe Google it.
Sure.
Details of some of the works. So these are sort of medium scale, large. I guess they're large scale. I guess depending on your scale. Acrylic paintings on canvas.
That's a good sense of scale there.
Yeah. So they are. They were done as props for the film. They were. I mean, they became props. They were done and then became props in this film, which was trying to figure out how to make a sort of non-narrative video out of paintings. So that was the initial thought, like how could paintings become something that was not animated? So they're life size. So when you're standing next to them, well, you feel like they're life size, but they actually are slightly smaller. It's like Disneyland scale, like when you're in Main Street in Disneyland and it's like everything's a little bit smaller, but it looks life size. And then if you watch the film, the video, you'll see these figures like appear in live action, which I shot with Tucker Phillips, a good friend of mine and someone who I've collaborated with over the years. And he's a filmmaker and a designer, and but he also has the ability to like work really fast. So we just like moved around in like sort of different spaces and like created these sort of filmic scenes. And then these are smaller gouache paintings that were basically studies for the larger paintings, which is how I develop like all my work. Sort of like doing all the work, all the development small, like very, very like sort of like sitting scale, like if you're sitting and drawing or painting, and then like apply it almost like as if I was like a billboard painter. My social media has timed out. Like if you're a billboard painter and taking like a piece of art and like interpreting it. So I sort of work as my own like contractor when it comes time to do the larger scale works. And then the other, like sort of the major component of the video are these animations that were done using a turntable in my studio and a garbage can. So like in my studio, like I have this turntable here, which is not plugged in. It was like doing these paintings that I then mounted on a trash can, which is also my trash can, which is sitting over here, over in the distance. So I made like these, I used the trash can and mounted it on the turntable with these like cylinders. And the idea was like sort of thinking about like a zoetrope. There isn't a zoetrope, it's just like a bluratrope, but it does create movement, and it was just like a way to make an image like out of like materials in the studio, which is like another, like it's like an aspect of what I do, which is like developing things like very much with like what's at hand.
Sorry, okay. Oops. So here's what you actually.
I have not been in this room myself. I obviously moved to Canada because of COVID and difficulties. So this is my view of what I've seen of the gallery. So this is like a new space for Group Recall, a project space. Mm-hmm. This is the second show you've had in here.
First one.
What was that? The last show was just studio studio in the space, sort of.
Yeah.
First show.
Get a sense. Actually, this one on the left, I was going to say, is about my size. So it is like.
Let me see that one.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. She's great. Everywhere we put her, it was like, oh, she looks awesome.
Yeah.
And then the person sitting was sitting in my van. So there's the sitting figure, and that was filmed like in my van. There's two sitting figures. One was a painting of Matt, and another that painting, which were sitting in my van and filmed like she was like the passenger as I like filmed out the window.
Cool. Oh, this is from your previous show at Cooper Cole.
Yeah, which was, I guess, 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm. That's a better view.
Yeah, so similar processes involved. These are all acrylic paintings on canvas, but it's sort of, you know, when I approach these shows, like I approach them like projects, and there's like as much as I would never say there's a theme. There's a sort of, because the way the work develops is like it's an ongoing process that might be years, but they are like I'll pull sort of thoughts from like a long period of time. Like it might be a piece, like especially this guy like ducking into the circle, like that's a drawing I did like 5 years ago or something, and so that piece will then like fit in with like new thinking, which is like the piece on the right, which are these sort of like diagrams to sort of explain like states of consciousness or states of being. So you could say like the work in the show, the current show, that's the people as landscapes, is sort of, it relates to states of being. There are sort of like different ways to sort of like answer the same questions. And then the materiality and the formal work is like constantly in motion. So it might be in motion in like very subtle ways, but like these paintings came out of like they're directly from work I do in my sketchbooks. So in my sketchbooks, I do like sort of like mainly when I travel, I do small like studies from life. So I don't know, I have a sketchbook here. So
oh, great.
When like when I'm traveling, or like I'll sit and I'll do like a painting.
Oh, wow.
Just from what's in front of me. So this is like a woman paddling out on a paddleboard. And so like this way of painting is like completely different than the way I paint in the studio. So these new works are like a hybridized version where I'm taking the same like ways I mix paint. So they have like basically like an underpainting that's like a very graphic painting. And then I paint it over top using like how I paint with, like basically all my materials are like acrylic and gouache. So like that's like, yeah, that painting is an example of, there's a painting here. I like this one. I did this painting of flip-flops.
Oh, wow. Those are great.
Yeah, so like this technique, like you can see, it's like, it's just, it's not exactly watercolor because it's actually done with gouache. So it looks like a watercolor, it's like a wash. And when you're painting with a wash, you're using transparency more than you're using white for lights and darks. So you're painting darks and then going light, or using the paper color to be the lights. So in like a painting like this, it's like I start with this very graphic background. Like imagine these 3 characters made of like 6 colors. And then I'm painting over top, like brushing over top to create folds. So I'm painting, so that's why these are landscapes. So they became part of the landscape, but it's the way I paint landscapes in my sketchbook.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. I mean, yeah, I wanted to ask you how, like, what the landscape, the influence of the landscape was on these works. Because I remember you also saying, you know, you have this one landscape, but you also were talking about these people as landscapes and as sort of, you know, taking on maybe the characteristics of the landscape in certain works.
Yeah. And I think the title is a very dry title for me. But it's a way of just like, it's trying to explain like physically what's going on. So that one actual landscape, which was an animated piece. And so that actual landscape was just looking out the window of my car. I was actually driving north to go film on my friend Chris Malloy's ranch with Tucker. And we were going to go film on his ranch. And I was driving up the freeway. So this is the 101 freeway. And the one thing I have an ability to do when it comes to painting is like, I can freeze an image in my mind. Like, so I just was like, I'm going to freeze that image. Like, so you freeze some colors. I froze like the sky, and I froze these sort of layers of like road, median, curb, and then how the green obscured like city in the background. It's like Woodland Hills. And and I, you know, I never paint landscapes flat. I only paint them in my sketchbook. So this was like, so this is done on paper. I'd love to do this on canvas, like sort of further develop it. But I realized like what I was doing, like when I paint figures, like I often use figures as iconography, like I use them as material. And because this new work was influenced by work in my sketchbook, it was sort of like, oh, figures as landscapes. So like figures as like, just as like a receptacle for painting. And then same way as I use sort of figures as like a receptacle for sort of concepts or to speak to states of being. So the figures themselves, it's like I'm doing everything I can to remove the who are they feeling when you look at a figure, more than and make it feel more like why, you know, why people, what people are doing, what does this speak to, rather than like who are they, you know. But then within it, and I think over time, the specificity of who they are and the clothes they're wearing and the way they're formed and the tones and stuff, what made it'll change over time. But in the moment, I paint these paintings for the moment, and in the moment it's just to be more like a landscape.
And how did your process affected by the pandemic? My understanding was these were all sort of drawn from life in public spaces in Los Angeles.
They weren't drawn from life; they were drawn from memory. But I mean, and I mean, I think that's a big difference as well. These are landscapes drawn from memory, so much like that painting of the 101. And I think it is sort of like the 101, like how do you do a painting of not just sitting and looking at the 101, but driving on the 101? Like you can't like painting and driving, or it would be like totally complex. And I think that is a little bit like these figures. So every day I came home, like during the pandemic, I have a studio and I can go to it. No one else is in it. Jesse, who works with me, wasn't here. So I could spend the entire year going to my studio. But what I would do is I'd pass by on the way home. I would see people in the park. And what people were doing in the park was things that they used to do privately that they're now doing publicly. So that might be like laying out in a bathing suit, or, you know, like there were people like eating and like, but in a weird, like I'm at home way, like not like I'm going to the beach, like people laying in very public places, and they just wanted to be seen. And they also wanted to talk to people, and they, you know, to each other, and they were meeting. And so I think I was affected by that. And there is like a bit of an undertone, and people sleeping, you know, and there is a little bit also like their bodies in the park. Not in like a dark way, but like, you know, like you hear, we were so busy, like 200 people today got COVID, 80 people, 50, 5,000 people have died in Northern California, you know, and so this is like, how do you see, like seeing people became, I don't, you know, and none of this is conscious, you know, this is not like having a concept and making it clear. I just started painting people lying around. I started drawing people lying around from my head. And they are in the landscape, and they're the people that I saw like in the park. So they're sort of like in the landscape of the landscape.
Yeah. And what about, I really love the way they're sort of, so most of them are just sort of floating in a very ambiguous space, right? You haven't drawn the landscape or painted the landscape. And it's sort of, I mean, in some especially like this one, these two here, it's like there's, you know, where are they? They're not grounded, they're floating. They're sort of in between maybe. And I was wondering about that choice of keeping the paper white and sort of, but still suggesting a landscape.
Yeah, I mean, there's something about like this sort of like cutting things out, and my instinct is to cut things out and have this floating field. I think it comes from, I'm really detached but interested in, and I sort of like let it, it's sort of like I think there's a certain amount of like my practice that it's like I'm very controlling in some ways, but a part of the practice is to let things that are just happening naturally, like let them happen without questioning them. And I think like taking things for granted. And so I think one of like, I could say like, it's sort of like someone, like I don't go to therapy or something. It's sort of like non-therapy, like thinking like, so you're trying to figure out yourself, right? But there's no, like, I think I may have never been to therapy, but I think that would be probably like a shortcut to be like, oh yeah, this, and this, and it help you organize the makings of your like inner self. So I think like, if I was going to therapize, like so I think it's sort of interesting, like having worked so long in digital spaces. So, since I began making work, I've had a computer at my disposal, right? So as much as like these pieces, they're like, there was no computer involved, like I photographed them at some point, but they are like sort of like on a workspace, right? They're floating on a workspace like you would in like digital space. And then also like this, I think that if I'm using figures, but I'm using them in a specific way, they're never like, I'm trying to take them as far away as possible from that feeling of like, who are these people? So like removing them, like cutting them out, it's like mannequinized them. But it's like, no, these are just like everybody's. They're like not specifics, you know? So I think that it's like a way of like creating that balance where you're detached from the figure and viewing it more like as an icon or like an element of like visual language rather than like a David Hockney person where you're like the detail of who David Hockney paints, you're sort of like, oh, who is that person? And they often are people. It's like, oh, that's the director of this museum, or this is his friend. And this is like, how far away from that can you go? How far can you be like, oh, is that a logo? Like, oh, that'd be a good logo. That'd look nice on a t-shirt, rather than who is that person?
Right. Awesome.
And because there's no background, you can just put them on a t-shirt.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also wanted to ask you about you know, these two in particular. I was interested in that you paid attention to folds in the clothing, maybe more. I like that they're, I mean, especially with these pants, like maybe a little bit strange folds, like unrealistic folds. And I hadn't seen that before with you, and I was curious about that choice, which, you know, to sort of add some like different hues of blue and dimension and movement to the garments.
Yeah, that was, I mean, I could talk about the folds forever. I mean, because for me, it was like, I mean, I really, as you can tell, I really like to talk about like the mechanics of things. Like I like to talk about like how I made it and why. And I feel like that's like my way of talking about like what things are about. And it's also like understanding like, oh, if I do this in this way, which is how I paint these folds, it'll be legible to people. Like it'll be, even if like you don't care about painting, there'll be something about it because everyone's looked at paintings of folds. You can't help it. You've seen it. So that to do it in the way that I did it, there'll be this little, it'll be that newness. Kevin Lyons just said like a logo for a person. So when you're making logos, like part of it is like not to make it so like it's like, is it totally bizarre? Is it familiar? Is it clear? Does it read? Can you own it? Right. So I come from this world where from when I started, I wanted to make stuff I owned, you know? And I think there's an aspect of that to the folds. And then there's an aspect of painting in my sketch, painting from life. And then there's just like exploring like through process of like making things, like what like happens, like how can you surprise yourself? And so like the folds are like, someone else asked, like, do you take photos as reference? And the sensible thing to do would be to look at actual folds when you paint folds. Right. But like, I'm really interested in painting from memory. These two paintings were done from photos from Will Will and Matt, because they needed to look like them. But like the folds, I was like, oh, this is like so hard to paint folds that like looked like, I was like, oh, like how do folds work? And I didn't know. And at one point I actually did point my phone at my pants and I was like, oh, like to take an iPhone photo to try to like figure out what a fold is like. You know, like looking at my shirt, it's like, there's like, cause it's like, you think like, it's like just a shape. It's light on one side and dark on the other. And then there's like gradation because it's round and like some basic like art stuff. But like, I was interested, I was like, but what happens if I don't like, so with that photo, it was like, it's too complicated. And then I really like this history of like, in painting, like one of the ways you show off is like painting things that are folded. Like you paint lace on the collar of a figure, or you paint these silk with a cotton underneath and then wool over top, you know, like hair. And it's so like, I'm so detached from that type of painting. I was like, oh, this is great. Like I'm going to paint folds, but with no reference and no reverence for actual folds. So like, this is like example, like she's sort of casting shadows on herself as if she's made out of cardboard, but then you go like, those are folds. So I was getting to the point where like, I didn't want it to be like, oh, she's striped. I wanted it to be like, oh, those are folds. Like you called them folds. Right. Success. Right. Yes. But they don't, they don't make any sense, but they have to do with like how, like those feel exactly right to me. Like I painted them over and over and applied, like, it's sort of like when I do like my graphic paintings, it's like, I don't want things to just get lost in abstraction. I want them to be like almost lost in abstraction, like sort of like teetering on the edge. So I think for me, it's like, this painting is it's about folds. It's about the fold and the line. It's like when you're painting landscapes, it's sort of like to make the mountains in the distance look like mountains, not like, and to look like they're in the distance, you have to do some stuff with paint and give them a certain amount of form. I mean, for me, for like what I like to achieve in paintings, like, which is like a document of a place. Like I do those paintings in my sketches to remember it being in a place, usually a place that I'm like excited to be in. So I want to have that memory. So that sort of accuracy is like rooted in like a function that's like very internal to me. Beautiful. We actually have some questions, which is great. So I'll read one. You spoke about just letting it flow in your process. How do you decide when a painting or sketch is done? And is it still, and versus when it's still needing work from a technical point of view? Yeah. I mean, I think that's why I like to engage. I mean, I think that, like, how do you, it's much harder to decide what to paint. Because like, how do you know when to paint something? So I work in a process with sketches and I develop something in sketches. Maybe I'll do small paintings on paper and then develop them into larger works. So it's like sort of this decision, like, okay, this is gonna turn into something interesting. This is worth painting. And then while painting, I mean, when you like, so like, that's like that higher level of creativity where like, sort of like everything's possible. Like it could be like, oh no, it's just like, I should carve this out of styrofoam. This could be a sculpture. Oh no, this could be super graphic. This could be upside down. I'll make it big, I'll make it small. And then once you get into the studio, once I've decided, like I've made the canvas, I have the paint mixed, I have this sort of like stuff, like I'm in the world of like mechanical creativity, then that's what's sort of great. Like based on that question, like how do you know when it's done, is like the mechanics of it, it becomes more like cabinetry, like working, like woodworking, or gardening, more than like when I'm in my studio upstairs and it's like anything's possible. You're sort of like, oh, like, does this look like a person? Does that look like folds? Does this have like, and I mean, there is like a part that is more like ethereal and like artsy or something than like gardening, where no one else would know a painting was done, but I'll do one thing. And often that is about like repainting a background, like, so I'll take a background and I'll have like these tones, but they're very specific and they're sort of complicated colors that like flattens everything. So like I'll change a color slightly, like, and I'll have to repaint something and it'll finish a painting, but it'll just sort of like go like, and like sort of capture itself.
Awesome. And another question from Zoom. Can you walk through the difference in thinking behind your prior works with people and things like referencing the work that we showed in Circle or Loop versus these works, these new projects?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to understand is all this work sort of exists simultaneously. So this is work, it's sort of like, for me, it's like taking work out of like paper and putting it on canvas, taking it out of a sketchbook, like, and making it large scale, sort of like finishing it. So, but like, if you look at like the figures, like those people in a circle, like creating their heads together, like I could do that painting. Like when looking at that painting, like the decisions I've made, like, okay, I'm going to make all these people like they're all wearing sort of, I like this idea of like, of our time, there's this like base, like, so I'm going to talk about what the people look like graphically, right? So there's this sort of like base clothing. So which is a little bit like how I dress, but you might be like a t-shirt, a pair of pants. Like, I think in the past, that sort of dressing like didn't exist. It would be like pajamas or the clothes you would wear under actual clothes, like you'd wear like an undershirt, and then a shirt and then a vest and then a jacket and then a collar. And so like, we've like graphicized ourselves. So like, I paint people like of our time in some ways in this sort of like graphic way. But like when I'm making decisions, like I'm making like, oh, this person gets 2 arms, this person gets 2 legs, because it completes this image. And this image is very like sort of goal oriented. And it's like, it has this perfect circle. So it's sort of like everyone all these figures have to like conform. They have to like work together to create this like central singular thing that's happening, which is their heads are creating this circle of circles. Mm-hmm. And that is like often the case in those super graphic works. And so like but everything that's happening in the current show of these like, that are just figures, right? Everything that's happening in those is happening in both paintings. Like, how reduced are these people? What are they doing? And it's just like, I'm asking less like of these figures. Like I'm saying like, you can just be a figure. And it's sort of like each one of those people could be made to put their head in that circle, or they could be made to do more. But this is sort of like, they're truly like chilling. They're just doing less. And for me, it's like, I am like, that's a little bit of my instinct. Like when I'm taking on any project, or like when I'm doing animation, I think is like an example, like, does it have to move, And then in these paintings, it's sort of like, do these have to do anything? And I think like within me and in my work, I think I have this sort of like thinking that sometimes is like, it's like I express it, I put it out in the world, I like utilize this thinking for my own ends. And it's like, how much, it's like, how much do you have to do? Like how simple is the dance? And but I do think that it's like, for me, it's like, I do think of the same things, because it's like addressing like small ideas, like really the thinking and all the work. It's like these very, very small ideas that are like, about like being a human being, like small expressions of that sort of larger idea. it's a sliding scale, you know, it can be like sort of like loud and feel quick or slow. Yeah, different types of expression.
Yeah, I wanted to go off of that question actually because I was curious about I don't know, there was something about these works and your choices with them that made me feel like maybe you were gesturing towards a sense of community. I feel like I have a very human reaction to them when I see them in person, partially because of the scale, and partially because they seem a little more isolated than maybe in some of your other works, especially the one you were just speaking about with all the heads aligned. And you know, coming out of isolation and sort of thinking about what you were saying about how people interacted in public space so differently. You know, is there something there that you were trying to draw a sort of connection between works? Or is it maybe that's something I'm just feeling, which is probably a nice thing, but I was curious your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, that's like sort of like how do I like dissect my own work? Mm-hmm. I think there are things that are like I take for granted, you know? And I think it's like there's a given that, you know, even though like you look at those three characters, they're sort of like depressed looking guys, but there's like a warmth to all these paintings. They're like, there's this humanity, right? And totally. I think that like that's sort of like, these are these sort of like givens, you know? Like I think my history, my technical knowledge of how to make things, my interests, how I see the world, and then also like a sort of humanity that's like I want in everything. Like, how do I know a painting when it's finished is when it feels like generous, when it feels like something's actually happening that feels more like, I don't know, like like an experience, or like with a flat image, like things are either flat or they're like it's like good flat or bad flat, I guess, you know? And I think that I like the danger of that, the danger of like simplicity, of like, it can be like, oh, that's the wrong kind of simple. Like you just took out all the good stuff and you just made it simple. It's like, no. Like I'm going for, like, there's always that risk, you know? Right. But I think that how do you make it not like the good kind of simple? And it's like, you know, have humanity and have generosity. And I think that, you know, there is something to like what I was saying, like having these people do less, you know, in this time, do I really need to, like, you know, the image of the people in the circle and their heads together, like that's saying something that's like saying like something very clear. Like I've had a lot of response to that because that feels like, oh, we need that now. Right. But also, do we need images that don't tell us anything? You know, like, do we also need images that are just human, that are like speaking to similar themes? Like, so the people on the left here, they're completing this square in their heads, but the square is made of different colors, right? So this is like, these are people like, again, like I'm making this, like I'm using figures and I'm putting this thing in their head. They're completing this thing for me. Like this image is like working for me. And then the other thing that's happening is like when people are looking at this, I'm asking people to like read this image, or I'm sort of like creating this thing, right? And and that the people stepping on the faces, you know, I think this is like so much of like what I'm talking about is about that, like the demands of living in our time, and like the sort of like the burdens of imagery, you know? And so I'm like, how do you like unburden image? Like as someone who uses images and I love imagery, and I'm like a total believer that like everything is possible through images. Like that's like a baseline belief that like you can have an epiphany, you can cry, you can be connected with some unknown through images. Like I believe that. So that is always like, if I believe that, then it's like, oh, then there's this sort of weight on what I'm doing, right? Like, is there a time sometimes to, you know, these new works is to ask less of these images that are like my talismans or my, you know, my mandalas. Like, do we need like this super chill mandala right now? or do I personally,
Right. Some other really good questions on Instagram. Okay, I'll read them out. Do you impart constraints on your art purposefully to force creative thinking or technical solutions?
Yeah, totally. It comes so naturally now that it just seems like, oh, that's just how things get made. And I think that is like also how like all decision making in the world, right? Like if you're name a job, you're like reducing your vision, you're like narrowing your scope to be functional in the world. Like, yeah, there are people who are like fully wide open and they're just like blazing through like as creative people, but I know like that's not like possible for me. Like I know what I'm like capable of. It's like as a runner, you're like, sure, like when you're like on a trip, like in a race, right? There's like 100 people. And the people who are like going to go out super hard and like blow up. And then the people who are going to go super hard and just go hard the whole time. And then during the race, you pass people who are like, this is my first race ever. And then you go past people who are like super chill. And I think that in creativity, there's like, it's exactly the same. Like we can't all expect we're going to just be like out front, like blazing. You're like, most likely you like need to like, it's like survival instinct. So I created since I started working. Like I was like overwhelmed. Like since I was like a little kid, I've known I wanted to be an artist, but I was overwhelmed. So I was like, well, I'm not just gonna like go sit in a studio. Like I need like, so I think it's like, it drew me to like doing graphics or making zines, and it drew me like, those are all constraints, And then, so it's like, I learned from that. And then so when it comes time to like, when I have like tons of experience, I still rely on those constraints. Like I really like those constraints because I've come to know it, and that is my process. But I've also seen like how it like forces me to like make these sort of decisions and like not be overwhelmed. Yeah, and it's like my pace. It's my sort of rhythm. It comes to me very naturally, I guess is what I'm saying as well.
Great.
Rather than, I think as for creative people, like if you're like a creative person, you're like, well, I don't like to do it unnaturally would be like, it would be unnatural, like, and, but I think it's like, that's why I say the running analogy, because we all do have those constraints within us. It's like sort of finding the right constraints,
Totally.
Not just being like, I'm only using blue,
Absolutely. Another great question from Instagram that I'm going to also add my question to is, what is the technique between, they're calling it the non-brush strokes on your canvases, and why? So like, I guess not being able to see the brush strokes. But my question that I was going to ask you is, I love that you can see some brush strokes in your new works, specifically the works on paper. And I was wondering about that choice as well. Like in these works, when you see them in person, there's, and I love it because I can tell you did it on purpose.
Oh my God. I mean, me and Brushstrokes.
Go for it.
Yeah. Yeah. Like 10 years of making Brushstrokes disappear.
Right.
And then doing a show where you do Brushstrokes is like, and like knowing that it's like a great reason to have Brushstrokes is totally. Like, it's hilarious. Like it was just like one day I was just like painting in the studio, Brushstrokes. And yeah, it's been, the process of like developing this technique has been super, like it's like made me paint, I think in some ways when you think of constraints. So my first like painting show, it was this kind of work was like around 2007 at Half Gallery was my show, The West Is. And it was like, so like the brushstrokes, the no brushstrokes thing sort of like came out of backgrounds. So I would do a painting that was, it was like a way of like, how do I interpret like everything I'd learned at that time? Like everything I was doing was sort of like coalescing. And I'd done one painting of this like cowboy, whose head was a circle. And I was like, how? And I saw it as like shapes. It was like, oh, this is there's no outlines, I was like completely, it was like, felt like a total analog, like a conceptual and physical analog of like drawing in Adobe Illustrator. It was like, oh, this is like this graphic thing that feels like of the world, like it felt finished, but it also felt like digital. And there was this like vibration. And I felt like what was so important about that was like, to see no hand, like, which was like part of my history of coming from printmaking. And up until that point, I was doing all this, like basically sign painting. I was doing these large installations, I was doing silk screens, and I was mixing silk screens with hand painted things, or I was doing paintings like that were like stencils almost and done with tape at large scale. So it was like this way of like no brushstrokes comes from this, like that development, you know, that like, how do you make something look like a silk screen, and my own like personal history. And then I just like took it, like how many levels can you take it, like of this process. And so it went from like different types of paint, like, so using cell animation paint and mixing colors in a way. So a lot of the colors, so there's colors that could be sprayed, that had to be sprayed, like black. And Robert Motherwell talks about that. I've read a book of Robert Motherwell. Him and a bunch of painters were obsessed with flat black. And I sort of like, that is like part of it. Like, how do you, like this flatness of black, and that had to be sprayed. So that's working with a high volume, low pressure gun and a compressor, masking and painting. And then there are colors that could be brushed, like, so colors that were light. And then I switched paint. So I switched from these like cell animation acrylics to like golden acrylics, and basically like color. I'm now painting with like basically colored gesso. And so it's like that gesso quality, like gesso's this like amazing material that is basically like, you know, it's like, I'm trying to get to the point where it's just like pigment floating on the canvas, like elemental paint. And then it became this almost entirely sprayed with stencils, but some, you know, some brushwork. And I think that technique, there's like moments in it where it's like, I like it because it's technique that's sort of like invisible. Like, it's like the technique, it's like when you paint a bike, when you paint a car, it's like everything in our world. Like, I go around the world going like, man, there's a lot of good painters out there, but they're doing this paint that's meant to look like no one painted it. It's like, oh, it came from a factory. But so much stuff that comes from factories, it's like, just because someone's a really good painter and they didn't get their fingerprints or drips on it, you know? So like, anyway, like, so the flatness in the paintings is about that, like technique. And like, yeah, these paintings of like super fine lines, and like what the process, like developing the process in the studio to like do that sort of work. And, but also knowing that it wasn't, you know, it's like part of my own like personal, like it's part of my personal process, less than process that like maybe matters, you know? And so that's what's sort of interesting. Like the minute I started like these new works of like showing brush strokes and like sort of mixing materials, like, because in all those paintings with brush strokes, there's areas that are completely flat. And I think that's, to me, like, that's sort of like achieving the same thing. It's like sort of this, how can like materiality and yeah, just like how I like to talk about how things are made, like how can that start to matter, and how can it like distort, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. And we're getting like lots of nice comments on Instagram about what you said.
Yeah, sorry, I can't really read these because they're.
Oh, that's no problem.
So fast. Yeah.
They're going quickly. No, but a lot of people who are listening were really interested in what you said about generosity and that being when the work is done.
Yeah, I think that is like, that's really essential. Like when I look at my work, that it's never, you know, I think especially in the work, like I think some of the work from that show, like The People in a Circle, like there's a type of maybe like cleverness, or like I don't know if cleverness is the word, but it's sort of like finishedness to the work, you know, that with a super iconic work. And I think that the idea is like, it's like, no, this is just a way to like step past like this actual thing and go, like, let it take you somewhere else. you know? And I think that is a type of, ideally, the work that, even if it is like clever or like catchy or something, then it still takes you, it still takes you somewhere. It's not like done, you know? And that energy is something like I've been pursuing for probably since I started making work, and not since I started making work, since like early 2000s, because I saw in work I was making that wasn't that, and I was like, oh, what is that? It's this super abstract concept of generosity in image making. So like, which is good, like when you have something like really ethereal to like go like sort of attain.
Absolutely. Well, it's nice that it's so felt as well by who've seen
that's
the
great
work.
to hear from me.
Yeah. And I think one last question that I have here, as we're at an hour already, is how do you approach your color palette selection? It's a very simple and good question.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's the other, I mean, we're talking about, this is all this stuff I talk about, like people are interested in like the mechanics of the painting, the technical stuff. And I think we had like planned more conceptual stuff, but I think that the reality is like, how much does, like, I think that the palette, like, so the other thing that's happening, like when I was talking about like the flatness in work, or like the other thing, like the thing that's really happening in these paintings is color. So it's like accepting, you know, so from the start of those, of me doing paintings, it was like, oh, like, it's sort of like if you take brushstrokes out and you take like sort of like working on the canvas out of the equation, you're sort of left with these like very limited, limited materials and like, or like sort of tools. So like color becomes like really, really important. So there's good, simple, bad, simple. And like, it's sort of like the color, that's like everything hinges on that. And so that I became super just attuned to like mixing color and experimenting again, like learning. Like I put a color wheel up on my wall that's still up in my studio because I can't memorize it. And I play with like, what is a blue that's not a blue? So like, if it's like, I'm working with figures and I'm like, how can a person, like, there's like a Playmobil person, you know, and then there's like a real person, and then there's this like sort of like, how do you this sort of like sliding scale between the two? And then it's on one side you have like blue and you have purple, or you have blue and green, or like greeny blue. And then how do you, and then if it's, but like within the painting, it's like, okay, I want the paintings to look like they're made out of like very like primary colors, that the color just seems like sort of like of our time, right? Like, so it's like, if you were like doing like a series of like, if you were like Arc'teryx and you're like, okay, we need new jackets this year, like, well, let's do a yellow one, a blue one, and a black one, and a gray one, you know, and like everyone will buy the black one. And so it's like, so I like that sort of thinking with color, and I wanted that color, that sort of like but like tweak that, because all like the greens are not really green, and you know, my blacks are never black. They're complicated, like often they're just 90% black, like it's black with white in it. But often the colors are like when like that background of the people in the circle is like, it's this really weird color. It's like on its own. It's sort of like when you look at house colors, like, and you put like, let's just paint it white, and there's like 20 kinds of white. It's that, you know, that sort of like complexity of color. So to answer the question, like, how do I pick colors? It's like, yes, I'm picking basic colors, but it's like really about like how colors work together to like take a flatness and not make it flatter, but like give it dimension and give it like a finish and like a flatness that feels like architectural or like sculptural. And like, and there's like a lot of elements in that. Like, so it's things I've learned from painting, like from life, like painting out in the world, like painting, like mixing color in real life and being surprised the colors in the real world. And then also like playing in the studio with like, how can I convince people with this painting that this purple is blue, you know, by combining it with putting different colors around it and creating this sort of like palette for the painting itself.
Totally. Well, I actually will ask you one more question then, because I know we wanted to have more of a conceptual talk as well. So I'll end maybe with a conceptual question if you want. And I was wondering about two aspects of maybe this work, but also your work in general, is the role of introspection versus legibility. Because I know legibility is really important to you, but I feel that there might be also a sense of introspective feelings as well. And I was wondering how those two things work together for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, like the so much of the work starts with introspection. Like often it'll begin with text or something that, like, I'll sit down to like with like nothing, you know. So when I'm working on a show, it's like it sort of starts blank. So you sort of like look inward and like sort of, I look for these like corners of my thinking that are sort of like unfinished. And then I'm like, well, I'm going to like flesh out that sort of thought. So it's like, it is like this sort of like, sort of seeking new territory, you know? And often it's like where it starts is with like where I left off. So keep in mind, this has been like a whatever 30-year project. So I'm like well into this sort of like the territory. Now I'm sort of like, so like I'll sort of start where I leave off, but I'm very much in like, you know, when I'm starting to work, it's like very much in this sort of like empty space. And then when it comes to, then it's sort of like, once I've sort of like I'm sort of like, once I've sort of like explored this like very, yeah, this world where it's even abstract to me, then it's sort of like using legibility, like using the sort of like the world of like legible language, like visual language or actual language, words, poetry, to like sort of like capture that ethereal world, that like very introspective, like internal world, and like capture it and then make it legible. Like, and that's like the game. And like out of that, because I'm like a believer in imagery, it's like, well, that's how you conjure images. That's how you like make things real, is like, then it's the game of legibility. So it's like, what tools do you have? And often I go like, well, we all know what people look like. So like someone with like, you know, too many fingers, like if you have like 7 fingers on each hand, there's like a sort of it's like, why is too many fingers, you know? And I think it's like, so I sort of start at like our most legible things. It's like ourselves, you know, like seeing like, and that's why I use figures. But then there's also like, it's like finding new images. Like it's like a piece of string that changes colors, you know, like string doesn't really change colors, and like string, you can make shapes. String is like a line, string is like drawing, you know? And so like, I sort of like follow this world of like, what like symbols do we have? Like a writer with like, it's like, instead of like a typewriter, like it's like this giant typewriter you have, and each key is like, that's like a turtle, and that one's a sailboat, and that key's an eyeball, and that one's a, you know, a tree or whatever. And you're sort of like, and you're, you know, you're not like, oh, a turtle looks rad next to the tree, because there's like, turtles love trees, you know? And I think there's like a lot of work in the world that is like that. But for me, it's like, no, I have like this poem I want to write, and I just have this weird typewriter, you know? And I think that sometimes like the work is like expanding the typewriter, but really it's just like finding those keys. Like it's like a very, very big typewriter.
That's a great way to put it. And I think also great way to end. And did you have anything, actually, unless you had anything else you wanted to say?
No, not at all. This was fun. That's cool. Yeah, thanks for people watching on Zoom. And
yeah, and for your patience with our sound at first.
I know.
Glad you stayed with us. Well, thank you everyone for coming, and for all your great comments and questions. And yeah, if you have any questions about Geoff's work, please feel free to contact us. You can email us at info@coopercolegallery.com. And yeah, thank you again, Geoff. Till next time.
Yeah,
Have a
thank
good
you.
day.
And I'll look into I guess I did like a hard post on Instagram, and if people have questions, I'll try to answer them. I know I'm not great at answering questions on Instagram, but I try to handle as much as I can. So if there's stuff on there people are like that I touched on that people really want to address, I'd love to get back to it. But
Totally.
thank you. Thanks, Cooper Cole.
Bye, everyone.
Everything. Bye.